So let me give you a little history of Buddhism, right? A short one. Buddha lived around the 6th century. And when he was, oh, this is going to be a long story. When he was ready to die, his personal attendant, Ananda, asked him, well, what are we going to do when you die? And the Buddha says, well, I've been teaching you for 40 years. Look to yourself. Be a lamp unto yourself. Well, that was not enough, because you know people. Right? They have to have a leader. They have to have sacred scriptures, right? And the early Buddhists were not different. So a couple of weeks, or I think it's 4 weeks after the Buddha died, they call it in Pali. Pali is the language, and it's the oldest recording of the Buddha's teachings are written. It's called Pali. It's called Pari Nibbana. Nibbana is the Pali word for nirvana, which you've heard of. The early part of the practice of Buddhism, what we call early Buddhism, is what we call Theravada. It's very psychological. And then around the turn of the century, about 100 to 150 years before the Common Era, there was a movement that began, Madhyamika, and then became Mahayana. And Zen is a Mahayana tradition. So everything else that followed the death of the Buddha was almost like a reaction, people's way of modifying the practice to make it more accessible to people, to make it more practical for people. The Theravada tradition seems to make the attainment of serenity and the attainment of egolessness the most difficult, because it's so hard to train the mind. So the Mahayana developed different techniques for doing this. But also at this point, the Theravadins had become kind of attached to the Pali scriptures, to the Pali canon, and they became scholars. They would have all kinds of debates, splitting hairs, just like what happened with the Catholic Church. Became legalistic, and so the Mahayana developed as a reaction to this, and this culminated in the appearance of what we call Zen. Zen is the Japanese word for Chan, which is the Chinese word for jhana. Jhana, most people think of as meditation, but jhana is the Pali word. It means that level of concentration that is the entry point to being able to see egolessness. And how do you get to that point? First, by developing a certain amount of concentration. What do I mean by concentration? Concentration is when the mind can become stable instead of going everywhere. And we do that by choosing an object on which we can put our minds, our attention on. Attention is a specialized form of awareness. It's just everybody has it, right? You see this? See, your attention went to my finger. Everybody is capable of attending. So the difference is we develop the capacity to attend, to direct our consciousness to an object to the point that it can stay. And there are days when it won't stay, right? But sometimes you surprise yourself. It stays. And I think many of us has experienced that when suddenly the mind becomes quiet and you find yourself, well, you lose yourself because you only notice it after the fact. Oops, what happened? I was gone. In Japanese, they call that satori. That momentary feeling of the self being gone. We'll talk more about self, but you probably all know what self is, right? When I say I, what does I refer to? That is self. When I say mine, what does mine refer to? That is self. The beauty of Theravada is that it's very psychological, so it lends itself nicely to what we commonly and mostly know, Western psychology. So self is not a very deep philosophical concept. Self is simply what we mean when we say I, my, our, us, we. So my body. I'm hitting this. I'm not really hitting it. It's my hand that's hitting it. Huh? But my hand is me. See? Body. 2, I feel you're not listening to me. I am angry. It's not I that is angry. But we claim ownership over the anger so that it's my anger. I am angry. I am hungry. As a matter of fact, Spanish is even more clear. Tengo hambre. I have. Tengo miedo. You know, it's all they own. It's more direct to the point. Self is what we own. But when we study and practice, we find out it owns us. So, feeling. By feeling, I don't necessarily mean anger. Vedana is the Pali word. It's what attracts or repulses us. So, something beautiful might attract us. Something like snot might repel us, or disrespectful or inconsiderate action, repels us. So that quality of repulsion or attractiveness, that is Vedana. Then third is interpretation, Sanya. We all have our ways of interpreting things, including beauty, including ugly. If you notice, so much of it is cultural. There was a time when tattoos were ugly, and now they're beautiful. There was a time when scarifications, where you hide it, you cover it with cosmetic, and now people actually scarify themselves, and it becomes beautiful. Interpretation. But we think that because we see it that way, that is how everybody sees it. And culturally, we share some of those perceptions together, but it's not, everybody's is different. So the common example is when people, for instance, like 12 people, they see an event, so the reporter takes down their stories. And there are some common things that they mention, but there are also some unique things that they mention. That's perception. Which is why, for me, democracy is very useful. Is because then you put together demos, people, and what everybody else is saying. And not everybody agrees, but you put it all together, and you have a sense for what the whole group is about. But there will be differences. That's democracy. But that's also real life. We don't think that way. We think that because this is how we see things, oh, he's wrong. He's wrong. And then somebody says, I don't think so. Because they have their own interpretation of something. Interpretation, perception, sanya. Fourth is sankhara, is those elements that create what they call in Buddhism karma, kama in Theravada, action, like fear, or craving, desire, lust, ignorance, not knowing what it is that you're seeing, deluded, you think this is real, like ego. All of that sankara, it shapes the actions that come out of us. And in Buddhism, there are three kinds of actions. Action of the mind, speech, and body. Usually we notice action of speech or action of body, and we think that only us know what we're thinking. But have you heard of body language? We might be able to keep it a secret, but our body shows it. So like stress, for instance, or how we use our bodies. In Buddhism, there's a teaching, which is, of course, just like everything else in Buddhism, is something that's up to you to explore and to investigate whether it's true. But in Buddhism, it says everything begins in the mind. Everything. Even when you don't seem to be conscious of what the mental precedent is for your action. So mind is the hardest thing. Number one, to see. Number two, to control. So when we choose an object to begin to train the mind, we use something a little bit easier, body. The fifth, these are called aggregates. Aggregates, components of the self. The fifth is consciousness. So there is the physical, or the five physical sense organs: sight, sound, touch, smell, and taste. All of those that enter consciousness, the fifth, is rupa, body. That's just one of the things that we refer to when we say, I, you're in my way. Actually, what you mean is that they are in the way of your body. Because it's not that they are in your way. They're in the way of your body. My body, I'm sitting here. I'm not sitting here. It's my body that's sitting here. I mean, if you see that. Or I hear you. It's not you that I'm hearing. I'm hearing the sound. But that sound is you. See, it's not. It's just a sound. What makes it you is the second part. Interpretation, perception. So body and mind. Body is the first part, through the five physical sense organs, and the rest, everything else, is mind. Everything else is mind. So Buddhist practice, especially in the Theravada tradition, tends to focus on mind. Zen is a little bit different. It seems to focus on the mind, but it focuses on the mind through what? Through the body. And this is what I think Cindy was referring to, the rigidity of the posture. It's not that the posture is rigid. But in Zen, you learn a certain way of sitting. And they derived it from the writings in the Pali Canon, but then they modified it. So they say cross-legged position. But that's because during the time of the Buddha, that's what people did when they sat. They sat cross-legged. Americans usually don't sit, except for these three. They're sitting on the floor, but usually people sit in chairs. So the most important thing is that you're sitting, but the posture is important. And after a while, for me, I started sitting that way, with your middle finger, the left over the right, this first joint over the first joint, and then the tips of your thumbs just touching very lightly, as though it were holding a sheet of paper between them. And you hold your hands. This is a mudra. Mudra is the way that hands are held over your hara, as though there were empty eggshells under your arms. And you're sitting cross-legged, in the full lotus position, or the half lotus like you saw Sharon do. And the back is erect. For me, what is important is that, number one, you're sitting. And number two, that the upper body is erect. Not stiff, not rigid, but held up by your own muscles. Because when you lie back, what happens? We tend to become less mindful of our bodies because we are trusting the chair or whatever it is to support us. And so when we are less mindful, the attention also drifts. It's not as strong. So a certain amount of discomfort can make us alert, right? Like if you're walking on the side of the mountain, there's a precipice, you're very alert, right? Or you're in front of a snake or, a centipede or something, you're very alert, right? But when you're at home and you're in bed and, and we let down our guard, right? Our attention is not as strong. In meditation, we have to really sharpen the attention. So we do this by making sure that our body stays erect. The sitting, what is important is that you're sitting in a position that is stable and that you can maintain over a long period of time without having to adjust. Pain is unnecessary. Some pains are just part of having a body. But just think of pain that we can avoid. Anyway, so that's the first teaching on egolessness. So we begin with self. And if you stay with the group, you'll probably hear this hundreds of times until it's coming out of your ears. But anyway, so Zen, let me see. My notes. Zen was in large measure was a reaction to early Buddhism. And early Buddhism had become attached to their scriptures, to the recorded teachings of the Buddha, which started to be written around the 1st century before the Common Era. The problem with writing things down is you begin to, number one, to begin to own it, and after a while you begin to treat it as though it were divinely inspired. So we think of that in terms of the Jewish Bible or the Quran or the Christian Bible. people venerated it so much that they say it's inspired by God. It's just words. Before they were written down, they were passed on verbally, orally, through memorization, just like Homer's Odyssey and the Iliad. They were recited by bards. And the bards would come to special gatherings, and they would get paid or be provided a meal, and they would tell stories with almost predictable storylines. So the Theravadins and other, there were like 24 different schools. They became attached to their scriptures. So the Mahayana, number one, they brought their own scriptures, but it's attributed to the Buddha. But there was a group that became Zen, and if you go to the second phase, and these are the 4 lines that are attributed to Bodhidharma. Bodhidharma was an Indian monk, supposedly, who started the tradition of Zen. He became the first Zen patriarch. We don't know whether that's true or not. As a matter of fact, the discoveries that they made in Tuhuang in central China kind of negated that Zen started from one person. It was just the evolution of the teaching. Around that time, there was another major school in China. Nowadays we call it Taoism. And Taoism would go up and down like a seesaw. Sometimes Taoism or Confucianism, sometimes Buddhism was the one that was favored by the emperor, and therefore everybody was a Buddhist, everybody was a Taoist. Eventually, they kind of assimilated one another. So Zen is almost like a marriage between Buddhism and Taoism. Very close similarity. So anyway, these 4 statements are attributed to Bodhidharma. Bodhi is the mind, an enlightened mind, and we're all capable of that. And Dharma is teaching, the Buddha's teaching. The 4 are, it's a special transmission outside of the scriptures. So you don't need the suttas. Sutta is the name for a discourse in Pali. Discourse, in other words, the teaching of the Buddha, a lecture. But it's not just a lecture, it's a teaching of the Buddha. In Sanskrit, it's called sutra. So a special transmission outside of the scriptures, not founded upon words and letters. Because they were reacting to how Buddhists had kind of put words on a pedestal. Third, that points directly to one's mind, not through any medium. And it lets one see into one's own true nature, which is what you were talking about, Joey, in terms of egolessness, and thus attain Buddhahood. Special transmission. Special transmission means, you mentioned also koan. Well, I'm glad you came tonight because you're giving all kinds of ideas. Koan is a technique, and Zen developed its own techniques for what they call special transmissions. What is transmitted is the realization of true nature. And this realization is what we call in the Theravada tradition vipassana. So different languages, different terms, but if you know what the process is, then you can translate from one to the other. whether it's Pali or Sanskrit or English or whatever, or Theravadan or Zen or Tibetan language. And that's one of the teachings in Zen. Don't get hung up on language, on words. Do not worship words. We encountered this sometimes among our fellow Americans who are Christians, and they have, or Muslims, and they have taken the words of their so-called holy books and applying it legalistically. When they were written many, many centuries ago, when people didn't know what we know today, and still consider it as Bible truth. Buddhism is not like that. These are just words pointing at something else. So in the Zen tradition, we talk about the finger pointing at the moon. In the Zen tradition, they call this Teisho. Teisho is what I'm doing tonight. Giving you a finger pointing at the moon. But it's not the finger. You need to yourself be able to look and see the moon, not the finger. Don't get hung up on the finger. Because the finger has different kinds of, as you just experienced, different interpretations. Like in some cultures, you say this, you do this with your hand, it means to go away from them. Whereas in America, it means come. In Italy, when you do this, it means go away. It's all a matter of interpretation. So it's a special transmission. What is special? See, at this point, this is about the 7th century of the Common Era now. So we have gone from the 6th century before the Common Era to about the 7th century of the Common Era. That's a lot of time, right? 7 for about almost 1 millennia, 1,000 years. At that point, there was a philosophy, a school of philosophy within Buddhism. They called mind only. So this is a transmission of mind to mind, which is kind of really similar to what was occurring in India at that time. I don't want to prolong this too long. Oh my God, it's 8:43 already. Okay, let me just read you some points.